Dawn broke like a held breath over the fields, thin, cold, and reluctant to arrive. Frost glazed the furrows in a pale, unblinking light. Telephone wires hummed with a distance of engines and the low, metallic thrum of artillery far beyond the horizon. High above, the sky had once been a promise, a clean blue stage where boys became heroes. Now it was a corridor of smoke and falling metal. He came down through that sky with a lurch and a howl, his plane a ragged scrap of metal and flame. The pilot was young enough to still think in patches of sunlight, old enough to know the sound of a failing engine. He hit the earth not with a salute, but with the sick thud of survival, tumbling into a ditch and coughing up the taste of burnt oil and frost. His hands were bright with blood and cold, his breath left small ghosts that vanished in the air. For a long minute he lay listening, not to victory, not to music, but to the ordinary noises of a countryside that did not know his name. A crow's single nervous cry, the distant clatter of farm wheels, the whisper of a woman moving about inside a distant house. Training supplied a script. If downed behind enemy lines, expect hostility, expect interrogation, expect the worst. The world under his helmet filled with those words, brittle as glass. Fear in him hardened into a small, practical thing, the steady counting of risks. He checked his pockets, wrapped his hands around the pistol like a talisman, and pushed himself up. Every shadow might hide a soldier, every light could signal a trap. Yet those same shadows also sheltered small mercies. The slope of a bank to hide behind, the thickness of mud to muffle his movement, a dribble of warm air from a farmhouse chimney promising human presence rather than hostility. The contrast of the sky and soil pressed on him. Above offered glory, below offered only the immediate calculus of breath and concealment. That difference was a kind of moral geography, where ideals fell away and what remained was hunger, cold, and a more honest calculation of what people did when rules broke. He was not an emblem or a story yet. He was a body that needed milk and warmth and an answer. When he steadied himself and moved toward the farmhouse, it was with the raw, animal hope of someone who had lost his map of his life and was now seeking any hand that might point him home. He did not know whether he would find justice or exile, the need to survive. Smoke still curled from the twisted metal behind him as he crawled forward on elbows numb from cold and shock. The earth felt foreign, heavier somehow, as if enemy soil carried its own gravity. His ears rang from the explosion, but the voices in his memory cut through clearly. The stern briefing officer warning them that capture meant humiliation, cruelty, perhaps worse. Those words seemed dramatic back in the safety of the airfield, almost theatrical, but here they slipped around his ribcage like a tightening belt. He tasted dirt, iron, and fear in equal measure. Snowflakes clung to his lashes, blurring the edges of barns and fences that rose like silhouettes of danger. He pressed a hand against his side, feeling the tremble there, unsure if it came from the cold or the deep animal knowledge that he was now the hunted thing in someone else's countryside. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, a dog barked, a single sharp note that tore through him more cleanly than shrapnel. He crouched lower, heart thudding against frozen soil, listening for footsteps, voices, the unmistakable rhythm of soldiers on patrol. The wind carried only the creak of a barn door, but even that simple sound felt sharpened by suspicion. He imagined rough hands dragging him across a yard, imagined the shout of triumph from a farmer eager to curry favor with the authorities.
His mind was full of posters back home, monstrous caricatures painted in enemy colors, and though he knew propaganda often twisted truth, fear left little room for nuance. Every shape in the fog became a potential threat, every whisper of grass a warning. He clutched the pistol tighter, aware of how useless it would be against a world that knew these fields far better than he did. A glow appeared in the distance, wavering, a lantern swinging from a farmer's hand as he walked the path between house and barn. The pilot flattened himself deeper into the ditch, feeling mud seep through his uniform. The lantern's sway carved moving shapes across the snow, each one a reminder of how close he was to discovery. He could hear the man humming, tired, the kind of sound people made when peace was expected, not shattered. That quietness hurt more than hostility would have. It drew a line between life the farmer lived and the hunted existence the pilot had fallen into. As the light neared, he held his breath until his ribs ached. Expecting cruelty was easier than hoping for mercy, easier than believing that someone might see a frightened stranger instead of an enemy. In that suspended moment, fear wrapped itself around him like a layer of winter, tighter than cold, sharper than ice.
Morning rose through a veil of fog, turning the fields into muted islands of frost and shadow. The pilot moved slowly, guided less by certainty than by hunger and instinct. Ahead, half hidden in the mist, a farmhouse emerged, simple, still, strangely untouched by the chaos that had hurled him onto this foreign land. Training told him to avoid it. Instructors had painted enemy homes as traps where kindness was a disguise and doors opened only to betrayal. Yet the fog softened the world, making even danger seem tired. Hunger pressed harder than fear, pulling him one cautious step closer to the quiet house. Through the misted window, he glimpsed movement, a woman tying an apron, a man stacking wood near the stove, a child's coat hanging from a nail. Ordinary scenes, almost tender in their simplicity. They contradicted every monstrous image propaganda had drawn. No snarling faces, no raised fists, just people living inside the war's long shadow. Still, fear clung to him. He imagined the moment they would spot him, a foreign uniform in their yard, an intruder in their morning. Would they shout? Fetch soldiers? The mind, when frightened, builds its own dark theater, and his played scenes of capture with brutal clarity. Yet the longer he watched them, the more fragile those imagined horrors became. He crept toward the side of the house, boots sinking into damp soil, breath shallow as if even air could betray him. From here he saw more clearly. The chipped paint on the doorframe, the small stack of firewood cut unevenly, the way the woman paused often, rubbing her hands against the cold. They looked tired, not cruel. The fog thickened again, wrapping the house in a muted gray, blurring edges until nothing seemed entirely real except his own trembling. For a moment he considered turning back into the fields, choosing starvation over the unknown, but the scent of wood smoke drifted toward him, warm and soft, carrying a memory of home he hadn't expected to feel here. A sudden creak of the barn door snapped him back into fear. He ducked low, heart jolting, eyes fixed on the shifting shadows. The sound echoed through the fog like a warning. The fragile warmth he had felt collapsed under instinct. Danger reclaimed the moment. The contrast between threat and tenderness tightened around him like a noose. He crouched beneath the window ledge, breath tight, while the farmer stepped outside holding a bucket and wiping his brow with a cloth. The man's lantern swung gently in his other hand, casting circles of gold through the fog. Those circles drifted dangerously near the pilot's hiding place, each pass threatening to expose him to whatever fate awaited. But the lantern passed, and the farmer walked on, unaware of the stranger crouched yards away. When the light finally faded, the pilot exhaled a trembling breath, shaken by how mercy and ruin could coexist. Rising from fear, yet driven by hunger, He turned toward the farmhouse, unsure whether it offered danger or salvation. He saw her before she saw him, moving through the fog with a steadiness that belonged to someone who had lived most of her life inside quiet routines. The woman stepped out of the farmhouse carrying a metal milk jug, its handle wrapped in cloth to keep the cold from biting her fingers. Her breath rose in soft plumes, dissolving into the pale morning, and the edges of her shawl fluttered in a breeze too gentle to warm anything. She looked ordinary, almost fragile, the sort of person propaganda claimed would scream at the sight of an American uniform. Yet something about her calm made the pilot hesitate, even as fear urged him to stay hidden. He had no plan when he stepped from behind the woodpile, only instinct, only cold, only hunger. The pistol trembled in his hand, more a confession of fear than a threat. She froze at first, eyes widening just enough to register danger, but her reaction stopped there. No scream, no retreat. Instead, she lowered the milk jug slowly, almost respectfully, as if sudden movements might frighten him further. In that stillness, the fog seemed to pause with her. For a moment, neither moved. His breathing was ragged, hers was steady. She took in his torn flight suit, the soot smudged across his face, the shiver he couldn't hide. He expected anger or defiance, expected the hardened mask of an enemy. But what he saw instead was recognition, the quiet understanding of someone who had seen too many boys drift through the war's machinery. Then she spoke, her voice soft but firm, shaped by a language he barely understood. The words trembled around accents and syllables, yet their meaning was unmistakable. "You are cold." It was not a question, not an accusation, a simple truth placed gently between them. His grip on the pistol faltered, not because danger had passed, but because kindness had entered a place where he believed it could not exist. She lifted her hand slowly, palms open, offering no resistance. The pilot's heartbeat slowed, though fear still tangled every thought. He watched her bend to retrieve the milk jug with the same care she might use to lift a child. She stepped closer, each movement careful, as though approaching a wounded animal. She held out the jug to him, not to distract him, not to trick him, but as a gesture so human it felt impossible. He reached for it, hesitating. The handle was warm from her touch, and he felt an unexpected sting in his throat. Snowflakes gathered in her hair, droplets clung to her eyelashes. She looked at him not as a soldier, not as an invader, but as a young man standing on the edge of collapse. That fragile moment became the first shift in a world built on fear, the realization that the enemy might choose compassion over safety. When he lowered the pistol at last, it wasn't surrender, it was belief, small, trembling, and entirely new. Inside the farmhouse, warmth gathered in corners like a fragile promise. The pilot stepped over the threshold with the hesitance of someone entering a church he didn't belong to, every nerve still sharp with the memory of fear. The woman led him toward the kitchen without touching him, yet somehow guiding him as if her presence were a hand on his shoulder. The air smelled of wood smoke and rising dough, of a life lived far from the roar of engines and the metallic taste of battle. He felt awkward in the space, too large, too foreign, too aware of the pistol now tucked uselessly in his jacket. The farmer appeared from a side room, and for a terrifying heartbeat, the pilot felt the old instinct surge back, brace for the shout, the accusation, the grabbing of arms. But the farmer only paused, taking in the sight of a shivering stranger dripping mud onto the floorboards. His eyes, tired, lined, unreadable, shifted briefly to his wife, as if asking a silent question. She answered with the faintest shake of her head. No danger, no panic, just a quiet decision that had already been made. The farmer nodded once, a gesture so small the pilot almost missed it, but it carried weight, acceptance, or at least temporary mercy. And mercy, in a world that had taught him to expect hostility at every turn, felt almost unreal. The woman placed a wooden cup of warm milk into his hands. He held it carefully, as though it might vanish if he breathed too hard.
The heat seeped slowly into his fingers, thawing something deeper than cold. When he took the first sip, it was not just milk he tasted, but something like relief, the kind that tightens the throat and makes the eyes burn.
She cut a thick slice of bread from a loaf cooling near the window. It was uneven, still warm at the center. He hadn't tasted fresh bread in weeks. War rations were sharp-edged things, cold tins, powdered convenience, food that fed the body while starving the spirit. This bread, soft and imperfect, felt like a lifeline disguised as a meal. They ate together in silence, not the tense silence of negotiation or suspicion, but something gentler, older, the wordless understanding of people who shared the same brutal winter, even if they stood on opposite sides of the map. The pilot noticed the chipped plates, the mended curtain, the single cracked tile near the stove. These people weren't enemies. They were survivors, just like him. The farmer leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching him with a calm that made no demands. The woman sat across from him, hands wrapped around her own cup, studying him with the quiet attentiveness of someone gauging a wound. No one asked where he came from. No one asked what he had done. Their silence was not avoidance, it was protection, a mutual agreement that words could wait until fear loosened its grip. For the first time since falling from the sky, the pilot felt the trembling inside him settle. Not vanish, just soften. Bread, milk, and silence became a shelter more profound than walls. The barn became his world, its wooden ribs, its dusty breath, its shifting light marking the slow passage of days. At first, the pilot hid there like a cornered animal, curled beneath old burlap sacks and the sweet, dry scent of hay. Every sound from outside, the crunch of boots, the groan of a gate, the thump of firewood being stacked, sent fear skittering up his spine. The war had taught him that safety was temporary and kindness often disguised a trap. But the farm moved at a different rhythm, quietly refusing the narrative he'd been trained to believe. Each morning, the farmer slid open the barn door with deliberate slowness, as if to avoid startling him. Sometimes he brought bread, sometimes a chipped mug filled with broth, sometimes nothing more than a brief nod to say, "You are still safe here." The pilot began to recognize his footsteps, firm, measured, grounded in the repetition of work. This was a man who spoke through actions, not speeches. The woman came later, usually near midday. She pretended to check on the cow or rearrange tools, but always left something behind: a folded blanket, a handful of dried apples, a flask of warm water wrapped in cloth. She never lingered long. They had agreed silently that long interactions invited risk. Yet in those short moments, she radiated a quiet assurance that eased the tightness in his chest. Days passed like that, simple and slow. The fear inside him didn't disappear. It thinned, stretched, softened under the steady weight of their routines. In time, he began helping where he could. He fixed a loose hinge on the gate, realigned a bent tool handle, mended a strap with wire he found buried in the hay. He worked carefully, leaving each task just slightly better than before, as if returning something for the food and shelter he couldn't repay in words. The farmer noticed. One evening, instead of simply nodding, he offered the pilot an old coat, heavy, wool-lined, smelling faintly of smoke. It was far too big, but warm. The gesture wasn't grand, but it cracked open a space in the pilot's chest that had been sealed since the moment he crashed into the earth. Trust grew not in conversations, but in the smallest exchanges. The farmer leaving the barn door unlocked, the woman placing bread where only he would find it, the pilot staying hidden even when he longed to step out into the sun. Safety, he realized, was a collaboration. At night, lying on a blanket of hay, he listened to the farm breathe, the shift of animals settling, the wind pressing against the slats, the faint hum of a lullaby the woman sang indoors, too soft to decipher, but warm enough to imagine. These sounds became anchors, reminders that humanity persisted even in places marked enemy on a military map.
He thought often of home, of his mother's kitchen, of summer grass under bare feet, of the naive certainty that people across borders were different in ways that mattered. Here, in a stranger's barn, that certainty unraveled thread by thread. These people risked their lives for him, not because of allegiance, but because they refused to let fear dictate their choices. By the time a week had passed, he no longer braced at every footstep. Trust had taken root quietly, the way seeds do beneath winter soil, unseen but growing all the same. Winter sharpened in those days, turning the fields brittle and the air thin enough to sting the lungs. From his hiding place in the barn, the pilot sensed the change before anyone spoke of it. The farm no longer moved with its quiet, familiar rhythm. Conversations inside the house grew shorter, footsteps heavier, silences longer. Something unseen had shifted, and fear, real fear, returned like an old wound aching before a storm. It arrived first as distant voices on the road, clipped and cold, carrying the unmistakable authority of men who did not belong to this farm. German patrols, sweeping the countryside, searching for the missing pilot. The hunter's patience had run out, orders had sharpened, the circle was tightening. The farmer found him that afternoon, his breath visible in the frigid air. He spoke quickly, gestures tense. The pilot didn't understand the words, but the meaning was unmistakable. They're close. Stay silent. Stay hidden. That simple urgency pierced deeper than any threat could. The pilot retreated beneath the hay, heart hammering, fingers gripping the wool coat like it might anchor him against the rising tide of danger. Then the patrol arrived. Boots crunched across the yard, slow, methodical, unbearably close. Each step sounded amplified, as if the entire barn had become an echo chamber designed to torment him. He could hear the soldiers' voices, muffled but sharp enough to catch the edge of irritation, suspicion, hunger. They questioned the farmer. The tone carried that dangerous blend of authority and
boredom that made men unpredictable. He imagined the farmer's calm face, his steady answers, his hands tucked into his coat to hide their trembling. A sudden bark from the patrol dog shattered his composure. The animal strained at its leash, claws scraping against frozen ground, nose pointed toward the barn. The pilot's pulse climbed into his throat. The woman's earlier kindness, the farmer's quiet protection, none of it could stop a dog trained to smell fear and foreignness. He pressed his cheek against the hay, praying the scent of straw and cows would hide him. Outside, he heard the clatter of the barn latch, a hand testing it, a breath away from opening. But then, voices intervened. A soldier calling off the search, complaining about the cold, about wasted time. Orders shifting, the farmer insisting he had seen no one. The latch never lifted. The footsteps drifted away, slow at first, then fading into the wind. Still, the pilot did not move. He stayed buried in the dark, listening to the shrinking echoes of danger, fighting the tremor in his breath. When the barn door finally creaked open again, it was only the farmer. He knelt beside him, placing a hand briefly on his shoulder, not a gesture of reassurance, but of shared exhaustion. The danger had passed, but the cost lingered, the raw knowledge of how close fear and rescue could coexist. Trust, he realized, was not a warm blanket. It was a fragile thread, stretched thin across choices that could break lives. Yet the farmer had held that thread, and so had he. Night fell like a final decision, dark and deliberate, swallowing the last traces of daylight behind the hills. The farmer entered the barn with a lantern cupped low, its glow barely enough to cut through the cold. His face held a seriousness the pilot hadn't seen before, an acceptance that their fragile arrangement had run its course. The patrols had grown too frequent, the questions too pointed. Safety had become a wick burning to its end. He motioned for the pilot to stand, then handed him a bundle, bread wrapped in cloth, the oversized coat, and a compass old enough to have belonged to a grandfather. No words accompanied these gifts. None were needed. The woman appeared behind him, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. In her hands was the same metal jug she'd carried the morning they met, now filled not with milk, but warm broth for the long walk ahead. She pressed it into his palms gently, as if sending a piece of their home with him. The air outside was a blade, sharp, metallic, merciless. Frost crackled beneath their boots as the three of them moved across the yard, each step measured to alert the night. A thin moon hung overhead, its pale arc offering little comfort. The pilot walked between the couple, feeling the weight of what they risked with every shadow they crossed. He had come to them a stranger, a threat, a problem to be hidden. Now they escorted him as though he were family being guided through a storm. They reached the edge of the forest, where black trees rose like a wall. Here the farmer finally stopped. He pointed toward a faint path winding deeper into the woods, a route few would notice unless they'd spent a lifetime learning the land's quiet secrets. The pilot looked down that dark corridor and felt both dread and reverence. Beyond it lay a chance at life. Behind him lay the only kindness he had known since falling from the sky. The farmer placed his hand on his arm, firm, grounding. It was the first time he had touched him beyond necessity. The gesture carried the gravity of farewell. The woman stepped closer and adjusted the scarf around his neck. Her fingers lingered just long enough to convey everything words could never manage. She murmured something soft in her own language, a blessing or a hope. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the warmth in her voice. A moment stretched between them, fragile and full. The pilot wanted to say something grand, something worthy of their courage, yet all he managed was a quiet, trembling thank you. It felt too small, but it was all he had. He stepped into the forest, the darkness folding around him. After a few paces he turned back. The lantern's glow illuminated the couple, two silhouettes standing steadfast at the boundary of their world. They did not call out, they only watched, making sure he truly disappeared into safety. As he walked deeper into night, he felt the transformation settle inside him. The war had taken much, but in this hidden corner of enemy land, strangers had returned his belief in humanity. And that, he realized, might be the one thing worth surviving for. At the forest's edge, time felt strangely suspended, as if even the wind hesitated. The pilot stopped beneath a tall fir whose branches dripped with melting frost. He sensed that this narrow place between field and forest, safety and danger, strangers and something like family, was where the true farewell must happen. The farmer and his wife had halted a few paces behind him. They seemed smaller here, framed by open land and fading moonlight, yet somehow stronger too, bearing the quiet dignity of people who had chosen courage long before tonight. The woman stepped forward first. In her hands was a small cup, filled once more with warm milk. Steam curled upward, delicate and fleeting like breath on a winter morning. She extended it to him without ceremony, without words, simply offering comfort in its simplest form. He took it carefully, feeling the warmth seep through his shaking fingers. The first sip carried a familiarity he hadn't known he needed, a taste that reminded him he was still alive, still human, still capable of being cared for. When he looked up, he found her watching him with the same calm softness she had shown the morning they met. Only now there was something else behind her eyes, an unspoken sorrow, a fragile mixture of worry and hope. She reached out and straightened the coat's collar, smoothing it with the gentle precision of someone fixing a child's jacket before school. The gesture undid him.
He felt gratitude swell inside his chest so fiercely it left him breathless. The farmer approached next, his stance firm but weary. He wasn't a man of speeches. His life had been measured more in actions than words. He simply placed a rough, warm hand on the pilot's shoulder. That single touch carried everything he couldn't say. We did what we could. Go.
Live the life this night has bought you. The pilot swallowed hard against the knot rising in his throat. How could he explain what they had given him? How could he ever repay the price of their risk? He tried to speak anyway, a shaky thank you, barely more than a whisper. The farmer gave a slow nod, accepting it not as payment but as truth. A silence followed, long enough for the forest to settle, long enough for the cold to sting their cheeks. The pilot knew he must turn away soon. Danger still crawled across these fields, and every extra second placed them all at risk. Yet leaving felt like tearing away from something he hadn't realized he'd grown attached to. The warmth of strangers, the fragile sanctuary of their barn, the unexpected humanity that had carried him through days of fear. Finally, with trembling breath, he stepped backward into the trees. The shadows swallowed him gently. After a few steps, he turned. They still stood there, two silhouettes bound together, watching, hoping, holding steady in the dark. They didn't wave, they didn't call out. Their stillness was its own farewell. The forest closed around him, but he carried their kindness like a lantern inside his chest. Behind him, the couple remained at the tree line until he vanished completely, their figures etched against the night, quiet guardians of a moment that would shape the rest of his life. Years later, long after the war had receded into photographs and folded uniforms, the memories still visited him with the clarity of a winter dawn. Time had softened many things, names of airfields, the sharpness of orders, the exact sound of his engine failing, but not the farmhouse, not the woman with the milk jug, not the quiet bravery of two strangers who had no reason to save him. Some stories fade. This one rooted itself. He would sit in his armchair near the window, watching evening settle over his backyard, the sky shifting through colors that reminded him of that morning fog. His grandchildren would gather at his feet, expecting tales of dogfights or medals or victories. That was what war stories were supposed to be, loud, heroic, filled with noise and certainty. But he always hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of his cup, letting silence sift through all the years until he found the thread of the memory he wanted to pass on. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reverent. He didn't describe the crash or the fear that had clawed through him. He didn't recount numbers or tactics. Instead, he told them about a barn that smelled of hay and winter, about a farmer who nodded instead of questioning, and about a woman who placed warm milk into cold hands without asking who he was or why fate had dropped him onto their land. The children listened, puzzled at first, waiting for the dramatic part. It always surprised them when the dramatic part turned out to be kindness. As he told the story, he felt again the warmth of that kitchen stove, the tremble of relief in his chest, the weight of the coat the farmer had given him. He remembered how the world had been split at the time, enemy and ally, good and evil, ours and theirs. Yet in that fragile place, behind enemy lines, those divisions had fallen away. War demanded hatred. Reality whispered something quieter. People were people, even when flags insisted otherwise. He often paused when he reached the part where he stepped into the forest. For years he had wondered what became of the couple after he disappeared into the trees. Did soldiers return? Did suspicion fall upon them? He never learned their fate, and the not knowing became its own kind of ache. But he carried their courage with him, shaping how he lived, how he raised his children, how he understood the fragile miracles forged in dark times.
His grandchildren grew older. Some joined the service, some didn't, but all of them knew this one truth he repeated like a prayer. The bravest people I met in the war weren't wearing uniforms. Sometimes he said it aloud, sometimes only in his heart. On quiet nights, when the house had settled and sleep pressed close, he would picture the two figures at the tree line, the lantern glow behind them, their faces soft with hope and worry. He had survived because they refused to see a uniform first. They saw a boy who needed saving. That memory became his compass long after compasses stopped guiding him. And even in old age, when his hands shook and the world blurred at the edges, that story remained sharp, bright, and impossibly human. The one moment of war he hoped the world would never forget.